Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Forge of Freedom podcast. I'm your host, Alex Ooley, and this is episode 144 of the Forge of Freedom. Today, I'm happy to be joined by a special guest, John Richardson. John is a prominent voice in the firearms community and a passionate advocate for the right to keep and bear arms. He's the editor and primary blogger for the Only Guns and Money blog, where he shares his expertise on firearms-related topics, gun legislation, and industry news. John's involvement in the firearms world extends beyond his blog. He has co-hosted the Polite Society podcast discussing similar issues and is a life member of both the Second Amendment Foundation and the National Rifle Association. John grew up in Greensboro, North Carolina, and he earned a bachelor's degree in political science and economics from Guilford College, attended graduate school in political science at UNC Chapel Hill, and holds a master's in project management from Western Carolina University. Currently residing in the mountains of North Carolina, John balances his firearms advocacy with a successful career as a financial planner holding a CFP designation. This unique combination of financial expertise and firearms knowledge gives him a distinct perspective on the intersection of guns, money, and freedom. John's insights have been sought after in broader public forums, including as a speaker at the Second Amendment Foundation's Gun Rights Policy Conference, which was broadcast on C-SPAN in 2015. He's also been recognized for his contributions to the firearms community, winning the Second Amendment Foundation's Ray Carter Blogger of the Year Award in 2017. On a personal note, John is married to Barb, a registered nurse who is also engaged in editing the Only Guns and Money blog. And I'm excited to have John with us today to discuss the current state of the NRA and the ongoing trial in New York in the case against the NRA. So with all that said, John, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you for having me, Alex. I just need to make a couple of corrections. I am now retired.
Okay.
And so after I retired, I had to let the CFP go. I wasn't going to pay $400 plus for a year just to keep those initials after my name. But other than that, yeah.
Excellent. Well, I should have checked with you on that. I apologize. So you're a former CFP.
A former CFP. And actually,
Okay.
during COVID, I went back, working backwards. I got an associate's degree from Montgomery Community College in hunting and shooting sports management. It was just something fun to do.
That's way cooler than your other degrees.
I would agree.
and any of my degrees, by the way, for the record. Well, John, I'm glad to have you on the show. You and I met virtually through the Polite Society podcast. We were at least on one of the weekend editions of Polite Society together. And so we met that way through Paul Lathrop, and I'm glad that we finally reconnected. And I know you've been keeping abreast of the issues at the NRA, and I thought you'd be a great person to come on to talk about it, because just this week, the second phase of the trial against the NRA has begun, and it's expected, I believe, to conclude by the end of next week with a decision by Judge Cohen before the end of the month. Is that your understanding as well?
Yeah, that's correct. We're in what's called the remedial phase of the trial, where now, after the jury has made their decision, the judge will now assess what penalties, what fines, what restrictions will be meted out.
So I think we'll get to some of those possible remedial measures, as you say, here momentarily, or maybe a little bit more than momentarily. But I think it's useful for the listeners to give a little bit of background about how we got to this point. And I think a good place to start, and if you've got a different idea about a good place to start, is that's fine. But I think a good place to start is probably 2019 with the NRA annual meeting in Indianapolis. And I say that because that's where a lot of this sort of corruption and malfeasance began to come to light, at least to the public. So would you mind to do a little rundown of how we got to this point where,
Sure.
the NRA's facing this legal action in New York?
Well, I think you're absolutely correct about it being beginning, at least publicly, in 2019 at the NRA annual meeting and then afterwards. If you go back a little earlier, Pete Brownell had stepped down as president of the NRA. They brought in Oliver North, and Oliver North took it very seriously. He was not just a figurehead. He said, if I'm going to be president, I'm going to really be president. Well, that I don't think sat too well with Wayne LaPierre, and over time, they ran into trouble with Kerrygard, which brought in the Brewer law firm to help settle that, which was thought to have been a 6-week engagement. And we're going on to 5-6 years now. Once that happened, from the rumors I've heard, the gossip, whatever, Brewer got in there and Wayne was kind of separated from his longtime friends, and he was made very paranoid. He was told, I am the one who's going to keep you out of jail. And so it just kind of snowballed. The fees started going up, and people like Oliver North and Richard Childress started questioning it. And it came to a head when Ollie North was told, we're not going to support you to be president again. And he went away, and that was kind of the beginning. And then a lot of public information came out, letters from people who worked for the NRA, from Ackerman McQueen, who released information saying we had paid all these bills, the thousands of dollars for custom suits for Wayne and lost in Beverly Hills, stuff that was embarrassing. And then then it went to a lawsuit between Ackerman McQueen and the NRA, and it went back and forth. And here's where you need to understand also, it was like an internecine familial war, because Bill Brewer was Angus McQueen's son-in-law. And from what everybody has told me, they despised one another. And so even though Brewer used the NRA to get at his father-in-law fought back. And along the way, the Attorney General of New York, who had no love for the NRA, picked up on this stuff and started following it, and then brought, was that 150 page, 160 page suit against the NRA with tons and tons of information that unfortunately was pretty much correct. They knew the answers before they asked the questions.
Yeah, I've heard it described, and I don't know who to attribute it to exactly, if it was Cam Edwards or maybe Steve Gutowski or maybe you, I'm not sure, but basically they described it as, it started out maybe as a witch hunt, but they found some witches in the closet. There were bad things going on. It may have been in other words, it may have been politically motivated, this lawsuit by the New York Attorney General, Letitia James, to begin with, but they in fact found some malfeasance and wrongdoing. So the fact that it was politically motivated to begin with doesn't absolve the NRA of the wrongdoing.
I think you're correct. And I remember Jeff Knox saying to me early on that the worst part about it is that the only person fighting for the NRA members was Letitia James. And wasn't that a hell of a thing?
Yeah, really. Yeah, because that was the point, that the NRA kept pushing this message that they're being attacked by the New York Attorney General, but it's not really the NRA itself or the NRA membership that's being attacked. It's the NRA leadership per se, and the message from the top down was that the NRA is being attacked, but it's really not. It was their position within the NRA that was being attacked more so.
True, and along the way there were a couple of attempts to have intervener motions. One was by Frank Tate, it was bounced because he was not on the board. Then Rocky Marshall, who was on the board, it was eventually found that I think his term on the board might have expired, and therefore it was moot, so therefore they said he had no grounds to do it. And I think neither the plaintiffs, which is the New York AG, or the NRA, really wanted to deal with any intervener.
Yeah.
Who were there trying to sue on behalf of the members.
So 2019, like we've talked about, this problem really sort of comes to a head, and some of these issues start to get fleshed out in public. And there's sort of this power struggle between Oliver North, and there's a pseudo coup going on to get Wayne out of power. Wayne ultimately prevails, Wayne LaPierre, that is, at least in 2019, and circles the wagons of power for at least a time. And the Attorney General of New York files this suit based on a lot of the revelations that started to come to light in 2019, right? And they filed this suit against the NRA in 2020. And there's finally at least some resolution to that case based on the allegations of corruption and malfeasance and breaches of fiduciary duty, et cetera. And that jury decided those issues, right, in earlier this year. I think it was in February, the
Late
jury
February.
verdict. Yep. So, and in the meantime, and I'm going to put up an image here on the screen from, we were talking about this a little bit pre-show about NRA and Danger as a great resource for information about the NRA and what's going on there. But for those watching the podcast by video, you can see here it's a member report from 2018 to 2023, and you can see that the membership starts dropping pretty drastically and has gone from 5.2 million in 2018 to 3.9 million at the end of 2023. And so there's been a pretty substantial drop in membership since these allegations have come to light. And there's actually been I'd like to get your thoughts on this. There's actually been some discussion that drop in membership, and I think this is the story or the message that's being pushed by the entrenched leadership, is that drop in membership is because of the lawsuit filed by the New York Attorney General, when in reality, at least I believe, it's because there were these credible allegations of malfeasance and wrongdoing. And so people aren't willing to part with their hard-earned money to pay for Wayne LaPierre and other people's legal fees. Is that consistent with your thoughts on that issue?
Sure. I mean, I would agree with you 100% on that. People, if you look at the numbers, the annual members have dropped by millions. You figure there's like somewhere about 2.4, maybe 2.5 million life members of whatever kind of category. Well, that leaves you with what? A million two annual members. And people just started saying, I'm not going to waste my money. I'm going to give it to other organizations, whether the Second Amendment Foundation, GOA, Financial Policy Coalition, Firearms Policy Coalition. There are other places to give money, and that's what they've been doing. It's not. I would agree. It's what's come out in the trial: the waste of the money, the private jet flights, the suits, the Bahama cruises, the money going to Brewer attorneys and counselors, who is now the largest single vendor of the NRA. I understood, people don't want to see their money. I mean, the guy's getting almost $1,500 an hour. So how many annual members does it take to make 1 hour of his time?
Right. Yeah, and well over $1,000 that they're charging per hour for this litigation that's been going on, as you say, for years now,
yeah.
And incurred millions of dollars in legal fees by the NRA. So it's it's really been a racket for the Brewer law firm, and all really in defense of the Wayne LaPierre, Wayne's World, so to speak. I've heard somebody else call it at some point. The jury returned their verdict, and I'm going to put up an article here from your website. Again, no lawyers, only guns and money, and it's onlygunsandmoney.com. And it's an article that you posted back around the time of the jury verdict in February, and I'm going to get it pulled up here. But the jury returned a verdict and said that Wayne LaPierre was responsible for $5.4 million in damages to the NRA. And of course, that doesn't include all those legal fees that the NRA incurred on his behalf. So that's really, I think, pales in comparison to the real damage that was done. And frankly, the NRA, commensurate with their drop in membership, has had a huge drop in revenues, right? And is, I think, struggling to maintain financial solvency. Do you have any insight on the current state of the financial state of the NRA?
No, but I'm guessing this trial, the remedial phase, is going to cost the NRA somewhere between $15 and $20 million. And you've also seen appeals already from the judge's decision to say, I'm not throwing out the jury's verdict. So that the NRA, John Fraser, and Wayne LaPierre appealed that. So the NRA, we know who's paying for it. And we're presuming that for Wayne and John Fraser, the NRA may also be paying that.
I'm going to go back just momentarily to this graph from NRA in Danger, and then I'm going to go back to your article about the jury verdict. But I think this helps give some additional context. You see the total membership dropping by 1.3 million in just a few years. But then you see, commensurate with that, the total dues and contributions dropping precipitously from 280 million in 2018 to 114 million in 2023. So we see there a significant drop in the dues and the contributions being made to the NRA. And the NRA is a large organization with lots of moving parts and lots of expenses just to maintain normal operations. So I think it's put them in a difficult spot in terms of maintaining financial solvency, and they've had to apparently, or at least I've heard, and maybe you have some more insight into this, had to sell off some properties to help maintain that financial solvency. And in fact, filed for bankruptcy, which that filing didn't go through. It was blocked, but nevertheless, they filed and don't have a pending bankruptcy case, but did file for that. Do you recall when that was? I don't have that at my fingertips.
Yeah, it was right at the beginning of 2023. They filed, I want to say January 6th or 10th. The Special Litigation Committee in Wayne made the decision to file for bankruptcy. The board was not told. They filed in Texas because they had set up a subsidiary called Seeger and used that as the means to do it in bankruptcy court in the Northern District of Texas. And the Special Litigation Committee, the reason there was even one is because both Wayne and John Fraser were named defendants in the trial. Therefore, they should not have been making any decisions about what the NRA was doing in their part of the trial. Eventually, after a number of hearings, the judge dismissed it. He didn't come out and say this is a sham, but that there was basically, he said there's no bankruptcy here. And they did it as much, it was a legal maneuver trying to stop what was going on in New York.
Yeah.
to put that on hold or even get rid of it.
Yeah, to try to evade the case by the New York Attorney General, which ultimately failed. So after that, the case, these cases take a long time. And as we said, this case in New York started in 2020, and the jury finally reached a verdict in 2023 after a 6-week trial, I believe it was. So it was a lengthy trial, lots of evidence presented, lots of evidence heard. And I've got up here on the screen again, this is on your website, what was actually determined by the jury in their verdict. And this was interesting because this also relates to what we heard at the NRA annual meeting this spring from the top brass at the NRA. They kept perpetrating this story, putting out this story that the NRA was determined to have clean hands, no responsibility. The NRA was the victim in all this. We were the victim of outside third parties. But clearly here you can see that the NRA was determined to have some liability, including a number of issues here: failure to adopt a whistleblower policy, failure to administer charitable assets, various false filings, etc. So there were numerous violations here by the NRA itself, not just Wayne LaPierre and some of the other people in leadership roles. So do you have any thoughts on that before we move to the or anything else you'd like to say there?
I mean, the jury did, on the related party transactions, did say the audit committee, who was headed by Charles Cotton and is still headed by Charles Cotton, had approved many of the transactions ex post facto, but they were going to let that slide. However, there was stuff like payments to David Keene, who was past NRA president, as well as paying for makeup and hair stuff for Susan LaPierre that had not been approved. The whistleblower, you had people like Phil Journey, Rocky Marshall, Craig Spray, who had been the CFO, Ollie North, Richard Childress. They had essentially blown the whistle and they were pushed out. Your Esther Snyder, Tim Knight, Sean Maloney, they were all one way or another forced out. Some of the stuff I heard with regard to Phil Journey was just appalling.
Yeah, and I don't know if you saw it, but Phil Journey was on, and of course, he's a family court judge in Kansas, and he was one of the 4 for Reform candidates that was elected to the board of directors earlier this year, and we'll get to that here momentarily. But he did a podcast with Stephen Gutowski on the Reload recently. It may have been today, as a matter of fact. It may have been yesterday, but it was very recent. And he talked a little bit about the whistleblower issues there at the NRA. So I'll link to that in the show notes for folks who want to go check out that podcast as well. He gives a little bit of insight to the current trial, but actually he was sequestered because he was a potential witness. So he didn't actually see the first phase of the trial. So, but nevertheless, he still had some interesting commentary to encourage people to go check it out.
Absolutely.
So,
and I will say that when Phil was first elected to the board, since he was elected based on being nominated by the nominating committee, I was a little skeptical of Phil. That was an error on my part, and I have truly apologized to him. I actually went up to him in 2022 at the NRA annual meeting down in Houston and said, I really have to apologize to you. So I will acknowledge my mistakes.
Well, I'm sure he appreciated that. And he seems like a very congenial guy. Yeah. Yeah. I've never met him myself, but he seems like a great guy. So anyway, we get the jury verdict. And on the heels of the jury verdict, of course, the NRA hosted its NRA annual meeting in Dallas just a couple of months later. And in the lead up to that, there was a campaign by four candidates, they called themselves the Four for Reform, to get on the ballot by petition. They got on the ballot, and they were in fact elected, and pretty overwhelmingly. I think that there were three of the four in the top five.
Correct.
And so all four got onto the board of directors. And so that sort of set the tone for the members meeting, and then also the board of directors meeting at the NRA annual meeting in Dallas. Do you have any thoughts about what went on there? I do myself, and I talked in a previous episode with my father about what happened there that I'll link to in the show notes. But I'd like to get your take on what happened there.
The nominating committee was originally going to have Charles Cotton as executive vice president, with Bill Barr, Tom King, and my mind, it fails me, there was one other person. And when it came to have the meeting, the board meeting the day after, Cotton had so burned his bridges during the meeting of the members that they switched Cotton out from being EVP to now just being a board member, and they were going to have Ronnie Barrett as the new EVP. And then, unbeknownst to them, it seems, it was called the Gang of 12. And it was people who were finally saying, it was Buzz Mills who was working on it. You had Bill Bockenberg, who's now the first VP. You had Mark Vaughn, who is the second VP. Doug Hamlin, who took a great risk. I mean, he would have been fired otherwise if he didn't get elected EVP. So, and then you had others some people that were kind of surprising that supported them. I wasn't sure where Mark Robinson fell. He was definitely on the reformer side. Though not public, but would tell anybody who asked her, Marion Hammer was on the side of the reformers. So, like I said, it was not the people you would always expect. And I think the biggest thing that happened was when Jim Porter got up there and forced the meeting to stay open. They couldn't do it in executive session.
Yeah, that was actually a huge development, right? I mean, historically, or at least for a long time, they've had those meetings in executive session, and that was a great sign at the outset of the meeting of the board of directors, that it was open. It was an open meeting, and that there was some hope there that the reform efforts might make some headway. And they really did. They, with the exception of Bob Barr, the reformers got a lot of the leadership roles, including Doug Hamlin in the executive vice president role. So there was some hope there in the wake of that meeting, and it really sort of, I don't know, it was a moment of hope that the NRA might be able to turn this thing around. And of course, a lot of that was going to ride on, the continuation of that hope was going to ride on what the committee assignments were going to be. And can you say a little bit about what the committee assignments are? So the NRA has these leadership roles: president, 2 vice president roles, executive vice president, and so on. And then they also have the board of directors, which is a massive board for any organization, really, but especially an organization the size of the NRA. And I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I want to get your take on this too. The board is so large and so unwieldy that they have to have these committees basically to address particular issues and be more nimble and make decision-making, determinations.
I think that's absolutely
a fair
correct.
Assessment?
That's a very fair assessment. The only issue is that committee assignments are the sole prerogative of the president.
And the president, of course, is the non-reform person, Bob Barr.
Bob Barr. I mean, but there was hope. I mean, there were thought that he would work well. He would seek the counsel of Bill Bockenberg and Mark Vaughn, Doug Hamlin, who really seemed like he had opened up the executive office. Stuff was not hidden anymore. He spoke publicly on stuff. He brought in Michael Blas as general counsel, which was not an elected position, and so reduced John Fraser to being just the secretary, which was elected. There was talk that he was going to bring back Joe DeBergalis. That did not happen, and I'm not still sure what happened there. He brought back the former HR director, who had been bounced by Andrew, whose last name I can never say correctly, so we'll just call him Andrew A.
Arulanandam, I think is how you say it, but I wouldn't swear to that.
Better at it than me. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And then I was a little surprised that he kept Andrew on board back in his old job. So,
yeah. But nevertheless, there was still some hope, right? I mean,
there was still some hope.
Yeah. And so we've got this sort of basically time between the jury verdict, the NRA annual meeting, and then the second phase of the trial in New York, which is the remedial phase, right?
Yep.
Of this. And so the hope, right, was that with these changes in leadership at the NRA, with the election of the reform candidates, with the implementation of a number of reform minded folks in leadership roles, with the exception of Bob Barr, that maybe that was enough to show the New York court, the New York judge, that, hey, the NRA is making the changes it needs to make from within. And we've got this under control, and the court doesn't have to impose draconian sanctions on the NRA that will handicap the NRA going forward, right? That was the hope.
That was the hope.
You posted an article, and I'll put this up, that we kind of lost that hope. Would you mind to talk about that a little bit? And why some of that hope was lost?
Well, it got released July 11th, 10th or 11th. And the people, I had written earlier and I said, this was going to be a great opportunity for Bob Barr to show the New York courts that we don't need a special monitor. You have to be open and above board about it. And above all else, you have to make sure that Charles Cotton and David Coy have no positions. They headed audit back for years. They held the finance committee for years. They still are the chairman. So you have Cotton as chairman of audit. The only true reformer on it would be Rocky Marshall. I'm somewhat surprised at that. Bylaws and resolutions. I don't know much about Keller Frampton, but on that, the only reformer potentially would be Jim Wallace, who ran as 76th director as for reform. Ethics committee is now headed by Charles Cotton with Joel Freeman, who definitely is old guard, Wayne Cabal, whatever. The only potential in the rumor, and this is truly just a rumor, was that Cotton was put as head of ethics to go after Phil Journey because Phil Journey was not playing nice with Bill Brewer and had rejected him as his attorney.
Yeah, in fact, Phil Journey filed a pleading with the court trying to intervene and to have Bill Brewer or the Brewer law firm removed as NRA counsel. That was actually, I believe, rejected this morning by the judge. partly because it was filed at such a late hour or late stage in the litigation. But really, in defense of Phil Journey, he wasn't really involved until more recently because he wasn't elected until, earlier this spring. So it's not really any fault of his own. But nevertheless, he, I think, felt compelled to try to intervene at this stage because there will be no other stage to intervene, more than likely.
And I think from what Phil had told me, and I think it's pretty obvious, what we saw going on later, which we're seeing here, he saw a little earlier than us because he was a member of the board. And he finally said, whoa, wait a minute. No, this is not. He had just had enough and said, this doesn't fly. I did not know that, I'm not in New York, so we don't know for sure everything that goes on. You and I both can only rely on what we see reported, but I'm sad to see that. But
yeah, I'm in Southern Indiana and you're in North Carolina, so we can only get what we can get on Twitter and NRA in Danger or any other source that might have some relevant information. But
and Finance Committee, has kind of a mixture of people. But I counted 4, maybe 5 reformers on finance out of about 15. So
yeah, see Amanda Suffolcool, Buzz Mills,
Bockenberg,
yeah,
Mark Vaughn.
So and Vaughn, yeah, I missed that one at the bottom. So there are a few.
Yeah.
But of course, the concerning part is that, I mean, look how many of these, if folks are watching this by video, Charles Cotton is on legal affairs, he's on finance, he's on ethics, he's on bylaws and resolutions as the vice chairman, he's chairman of the ethics, and he's chairman of the audit. And the reason that's concerning, and I'd like you to chime in here too, is that there was no jury verdict with respect to him, but or no wrongdoing attributed to him, at least directly. But he failed to report a number of things to the board. He sort of acted as cover for a lot of the things that were going on at the NRA, and is sort of entrenched in that Wayne's World cabal. So this signals that the NRA is not really changing when we're putting someone like that in all of the committees, essentially, and chairman or vice chairman of a number of them.
Yeah, you're exactly right. He was not a named defendant, but he would be the NRA, being president and first vice president during that whole time period. And head of the audit committee, I want to say at least back to 2015, maybe earlier. And vice chairman of finance. So between he and David Coy, they had their fingers in everything. There was times where, from what I've understood in other articles, if there with the whistleblowers there were some official whistleblowers who are now, from what I understand, are now gone. They were going to bring stuff to the board, and he just conveniently made sure he was not there to hear it. These were finance people who were questioning what was going on with the Brewer law firm. They were questioning where monies were going, using Ackerman McQueen to whitewash expenses. People, you almost could not be fired for misusing NRA money.
Yeah.
If you were part of the most favored children.
And by NRA money, right, we're talking about those hard-earned membership dues that people pay. This is not an organization like Bloomberg where you have a billionaire funding the operation. This is an operation that's funded by a lot of hardworking, blue collar, middle class, white collar, maybe folks who give their hard earned dollars. And so this is really disappointing and a huge, I think is an understatement, a huge chink in the respectability of the NRA as an organization.
Yeah, and that's why people are not joining anymore. That's why there were some people who rejoined and now have said, I am so sorry that I've done it. People who had been members for years, but they did it only as annual members. A friend of mine who usually heads the resolutions committee at Gun Rights Policy Conference said, I signed up for 2 years. I wish I'd only done it for 1. Yeah. I was seriously considering taking my endowment life member and going up to patron. I mean, we got an offer in the mail. Do it for $250, and I was like almost ready to do it. And then this started coming out. I'm like, not going to do it. And for me, to the NRA, I'm a sunk cost. I paid my money years ago, and no new money's going in, but I'm still getting some of the benefits.
It's funny you mentioned that. In 2019, I was 29 years old, and I'd been only a 5-year member up to that point that I just renewed periodic, every 5 years or approximately every 5 years. And I'd considered going to life membership in 2019 when all of this stuff started to come out, and decided to withhold my money to see how it shook out. So I've continued to renew, but only on a periodic basis, not the lifetime basis.
And that's exactly what I've done with my wife. Yeah. And the only reason I did it was so that she could vote.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I'm glad that same reason for me. I wanted to be able to vote, by having that at least 5 years consecutive membership.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, so we've got the committee assignments now, and that really dashed a lot of the hope that we had that maybe the judge would see that the NRA was making the required changes you needed to see to not impose significant sanctions on the NRA in the form of a monitor. If the NRA is monitoring itself, governing itself properly, what use is there for a monitor, right? But
exactly.
These committee assignments show that not much has changed, or if it has, it hasn't changed quickly enough, and so it seems likely, right? And we can talk about this next. I think what are the likely outcomes of this second phase of the trial? One of those is a court-appointed monitor. Would you mind to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, the court-appointed monitor is only to oversee the finances, to making sure that the money is spent properly and with due regard to fiduciary duty and in the member's best interest. It has nothing to do with any of the 2A advocacy. It has nothing to do with political. In fact, I have the affidavit from Monica Cannell, who's the Assistant Attorney General. Even the monitor is selected by the NRA. Now, the AG's office will give them 3 candidates, and if they don't like any of the 3, then they will give them 3 more until they finally pick a candidate. It's and
well, I want to just say here real quickly, part of the NRA, or at least some of the NRA's leadership, their resistance to this monitor has been basically they're saying, if we allow the judge to impose a monitor over the NRA, that's going to allow the Attorney General to micromanage the NRA and run it into the ground. And that's not what by all accounts and by what they've filed, that doesn't seem to be what the Attorney General is seeking. As you say, they're allowing the NRA, right, to take part in the process of picking the monitor.
It says specifically, no political, legislative, advocacy member activities of the NRA, ILA, including without limitation management of donor-restricted funds. That's outside the scope of it. Substance of programs comprising their nonprofit mission, training, education, advocacy, litigation. They had nothing to do with the subject or substantive content of marketing, donor membership, or fundraising activities, including the maintenance donor list. But it did have some restrictions on internal financial controls, dealing with travel, expense and reimbursement, conflict of interest, related party stuff, the stuff that they got found guilty of, or found, I guess it's civil trial, so you're not guilty. They were found to have been liable.
Yeah.
And, my hope was that early on, before we ever got to the remedial phase, they would have done like Josh Powell, they would have done like Woody Phillips, they would have done like the NRA Foundation did with the Attorney General of District of Columbia and settled. Say, okay, and that would have saved, what, $20 million? They would have settled and said, okay, let's come to an agreement what we can deal, that we can live with and you can live with, and we won't even need another trial. And I think, especially in the good feeling right after the May annual meeting and the board meeting, they had hopes that they could have done even more by doing it that way.
Yeah. And do you have any thoughts about why the NRA didn't settle the case?
You mean, I could just say it was not in the interest of Bill Brewer. That's one thing. His level of influence over the decision makers, other than, let's say, Doug Hamlin, is out of bounds for what it should be.
Yeah.
He should be working for them. They're not working for him.
Yeah. That seems to be, I think, pretty apparent by now at this stage in the game. And of course, he can't charge thousands of dollars per hour or $1,500 per hour. I don't remember what the rate was exactly, but it's over $1,000 per hour for a 2-week trial, right? If you settle the case. I'm curious, though, if maybe there was some other rationale for it. Of course, sometimes the parties just don't come to agreeable terms. But it seemed here like the Attorney General was being somewhat reasonable, at least with, considering her animus toward the NRA.
Yeah. I would agree with you. I mean, I think she was letting the professionals in the Charity Bureau handle the case. Other than her doing an occasional news conference, it was up to them to handle the case and make the decisions about how it should proceed. Now, as I understand, yesterday was the first day she actually was in court.
I wonder if maybe, and I'm just speculating here, if maybe the Charles Cottons of the world and some of the other more Wayne-friendly folks truly believed, or maybe Bill Brewer convinced them that they could win the second phase of the trial, so to speak, by convincing the judge not to impose a monitor. And that thereby that might not give the monitor an opportunity to flesh out some more of the demons or witches in the closet, so to speak.
You may be right. From all indications early on, he was somewhat reluctant to impose a monitor. I don't know if that would be the case now. There was a last-minute thing from the audit committee that went out at 9 o'clock on Sunday night If you've read NRA in Danger, you saw Dennis Fusaro's angry response to it, for lack of a better word. I mean, I saw it about 8:30 in the morning. It's like, whoa! But that was stuff that they should have done if they were truly. That was something that should have been done weeks ago. And dropping it on the court at the very last minute is not going to play well. The New York AG's staff is not going to look kindly on it, and the judge doesn't like to be surprised at the last minute. No judge does.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And it takes a lot to prepare for a trial. There are all sorts of pretrial filings and proceedings that the judge has to consider, and so it's a lot of work on the eve of trial, and no judge wants to put in all the work and then have some last minute surprise.
Yeah, I look every 2 or 3 days at the filings, and we're up to like 3,500 individual filings, some that go for 20, 30, 40 pages, transcripts, tons and tons of stuff.
Yeah, I read through a few of the expert reports in the case, and this actually comes back to a point we were discussing earlier about the monitor. One of the experts for the New York Attorney General said that these monitors are normally put in place for somewhere between a year and 7 years, with the default being 3 years. So this is not a forever process. And really, the quicker that the NRA gets its affairs in order, the more quickly the monitor is removed from their duties. But I guess the typical time frame is about 3 years. So
that's what I've been hearing.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't know. Frankly, I don't know what would happen if the judge imposes a monitor, if how the sentiment of the membership that have left will change. Will they come back? How will the sentiment of the membership that's still hanging on change? Will they stay or will they leave? I don't know. Do you have any thoughts about that?
I've been feeling for a long time that a monitor is absolutely needed. We have I can't see that we're not going to get a monitor. So it's just going to be something we have to live with. If it cleans up the finances, and if Doug Hamlin, who has, once this case is settled, the Special Litigation Committee is no more, and Doug Hamlin has the authority as Executive Vice President and CEO of telling the Brewer Law Firm, thank you for being there, but your services are no longer warranted or no longer wanted. He can dismiss them. That's within his right as CEO, or within his powers. I think we've been hoping for that a long time.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think it would be a good thing to have a monitor. And I think that's the only hope, especially after we've seen the committee assignments, that there might be some change or some hope of restoration at the NRA. I'm going to put up an X page here from, and I'm going to get this name wrong, Eric Ubelacker, I think is how you say
That's as good as I could do it.
And then I'll put up an article from your website subsequently. But he is a journalist with the courthousenews.com, I think, covering the New York courts. I don't know if that's all of New York or just New York City, but anyway, he's got a decent thread on X, and he writes some articles for the Courthouse News Service, which is courthousenews.com. I'll link to all this in the show notes. But you see here on the X page, he's got a thread from today or yesterday. And here's what he says. And here's what the AG wants, the Attorney General wants in phase 2. He mentions what we've talked about already: appoint an independent monitor for 3 years to oversee finances, then also to ban LaPierre from serving on the NRA or its related nonprofits, restrict John Frazier, NRA's ex-counsel, restrict his role in the organization, and make the NRA send reports to the Attorney General and the court. So really, those sound like fairly tame requests from the Attorney General.
They do.
And frankly, I would have a hard time seeing the judge not granting those requests.
There is some speculation that Wayne wants to come back in a consulting role to help fundraise for the NRA. I went back and looked at the agreement and stipulation with Woody Phillips. And it said that he could not serve as an officer, director, trustee, any fiduciary responsibility for any nonprofit, incorporated, registered, operating, or soliciting contributions in New York. So NRA is a national organization. They're, of course, going to ask for contributions from the people in the fourth largest state in the country.
And the state with probably the most, maybe the second most amount of money.
Exactly.
Probably the most.
So, and they've been saying that the it's not just running a corporation or they're incorporated there, but they solicit money. That, to me, has always been the key. And Wayne, there's talk that he wanted to come back as in a fundraising ability, some fundraising capacity, or to make speeches for the NRA or whatever. God knows why. And that could be why he's fighting it so hard. Now, John Frazier, I understand. It's his professional future. He's 59 years old. Not many people are going to hire him after this if he goes out, puts up his shingle, solo lawyer. He's certainly not going to be making what he's been making at the NRA, upwards of $500,000 a year.
Right. And I suspect to some degree Wayne misses the being on stage with the likes of Donald Trump and other influential folks.
Yeah.
But that would obviously be a terrible outcome to have him back at the NRA. So the other thing here, it says, and I'm just going to continue down this thread by Eric Ubelacher. He says that the NRA has put forth a plan that shows the court their commitment to heightened compliance protocols. And obviously, I'm not going to go through all of that, but basically arguing that, listen, we've got a plan and we'll get this fixed. But then, interestingly, he says the thing we've talked about. He points out that Charles Cotton is on 5 committees, and he's highlighted those here. And then earlier today, it was revealed that the NRA, apparently Bob Barr testified that they hadn't decided if they were going to collect the money from Wayne LaPierre. What does that tell us about the current mindset at the NRA and their leadership?
I mean, as somebody commented on Facebook, I'm not willing to let bygones be bygones. But obviously somebody is. And we don't know if Wayne doesn't have the money. We don't know anything. But you would think if you get $4.4 million owed to the members of the NRA, not to Charles Cotton, not to Doug Hamlin, not to Bob Barr, it's owed to the members. You at least put liens on something.
And shouldn't that be up to the members, or at least to the board? I don't know. I mean, it seems like a weird thing to say we're not going to collect this money on behalf of the membership. That also seems to be harkens back to this, breach of duty to the members, and really shows that there hasn't been much change at the NRA.
I mean, I'll be honest, Wayne, if he were smart, would have done exactly like Woody Phillips. Woody Phillips is paying his $2 million. He would have paid his $4.4 million or whatever it is, minus he's already paid back $1 million. Because according to the New York AG, actually the real amount's closer to $13 million.
Yeah.
And why put yourself at risk for even more? Settle for the known amount, be done with it, and get out of there. But then again,
right.
I'm not Wayne. I'm not his attorney.
I like what you say here in this article. You say at the end, what do you mean you haven't decided to try and collect the money Wayne looted from the NRA? That's a good way to put it. I think that's exactly what happened when you talking about all those custom suits and jet flights for family and friends and himself and helicopter rides to NASCAR races, etc., all on the memberships.
So you don't get stuck in traffic like the rest of us.
Right, exactly. I think that counts as looting, at least in my book.
And I'll be honest, it's not necessarily the money. It's the damage to the NRA as an organization and its reputation fighting for Second Amendment rights, pushing out a Chris Cox right before the Georgia second primary, where we lost control of the Senate. Chris Cox had contacts within the Republican Party. There's no way that the Republicans should have lost both those Senate seats in Georgia. Politicians still look to the NRA. What does the NRA think on this? They still should have the best lobbying force. Yet I've talked to people in other organizations who do lobby on Capitol Hill and said, we haven't seen the NRA in a long time. And it could be they just don't have the money. And also the people with the expertise have been pushed out. And that goes to the heart of the matter.
Yeah. Yeah. And frankly, I can't remember. This may have been the conversation with Phil Journey and Stephen Gutowski. I can't remember exactly where I heard it, but I agree with this. That it was now announced last week, I believe, that the Republican National Committee wasn't including firearms related issues in their official platform. And I think that's got a lot to do with the weakness of the NRA. The NRA is not as influential now as it once was, and has lost its ability to influence politicians and parties, i.e., the Republican Party, to appeal to their members. When you're bleeding members at the rate of like 1,000 members a day, there's not as much incentive there for politicians or political parties to appeal to that base, at least in an official manner. Mm-hmm. So I agree with you. I think the money, and I think you do too, the money is a big deal, but the influence that the NRA has lost in fighting for the right to keep and bear arms is even more significant long term.
I would agree with you. And it's almost like, could you have picked a worse attorney in terms of gun rights to fight on your behalf than Bill Brewer, who gave money to Hillary, who gave money to Obama, who gave money to Beto O'Rourke? Okay, yeah, he gave it, but he did.
Yeah.
He's not, and he forced the NRA to become estranged from really good attorneys like Cooper and Clerk, people who had fought for the NRA for years at the appellate level, who fought cases for them. I mean, Bruin was a wonderful decision, but very little was followed up on it by the NRA. Everybody else took it and ran, whether it's FPC or SAF. And it's always been an issue for me. The NRA has always had not made here chip on their shoulder. If they didn't invent it, it can't be that good. They should be glad to share the wealth with other organizations, go in together, share the expertise.
Yeah, no, I agree. I actually heard that sentiment from Alan Gura the first time. He's the attorney who argued the Heller and I believe the McDonald case. I think he argued both. And he had that same sentiment. I think he was speaking at, I don't know, it's the Cato Institute or maybe a Federalist Society event. And he said, listen, Heller made it to the Supreme Court in spite of the NRA because it wasn't NRA's baby. And they put roadblock upon roadblock in front of Heller to try to get rid of it because they were concerned about a bad or an adverse opinion. And if it was a good opinion, it wasn't going to be based on their work. So there was sort of this turf, battle going on even with Heller and McDonald. And I think the NRA's got to take a different position, especially now. I think they should have always historically been more accommodating to other folks on the allies in the movement to preserve the right to keep and bear arms.
Yeah.
But even more so now since they're in a weakened state.
You're absolutely right. I remember a few years ago, there was a case in Washington State, and I was just shocked that it was SAF, the National Shooting Sports Foundation, and the NRA all came together to oppose it. And I remember talking to Alan Gottlieb, and he said it took a lot of effort, and he was very proud that he could bring everybody together in that case.
Yeah. Well, John, we've gone a little over an hour here, which is no problem. I've enjoyed our conversation, but I don't want to keep you too long. I had intended at the very beginning to have you tell us about your Only Guns and Money blog, and we've talked about it a lot throughout the conversation. But please, in closing, tell us about how you started the blog and where else people can find you. I know you're active on X and Facebook, but if you're active anywhere else, tell us about that.
Well, I started the blog back in 2010. I've been an avid blog reader, and I finally said, I can do this. And I think I had 19 views my first month. And then somehow along the way, I was doing a lot of reporting on Second Amendment cases. I think I broke the story about Bateman versus Purdue, which was the first post-McDonald case, where Alan Gura took it here in North Carolina to the Eastern District of North Carolina, where we challenged a law that said during a declared state of emergency, you could not have a firearm outside the home, no matter if you had a carry permit or not. And we won that. And a couple of other big bloggers would pick up my stuff and refer to it. And by second or third year, I was getting, I had an Instalanch or two from the Instapundit. I was getting 500,000 views a year, 500 visits, more than that in views. It's tailed off a bit. Blogging in general has tailed off. I chose the name because of Warren Zevon's song, Sin Lawyers, Guns, and Money. And since I'm not a lawyer, I said, no lawyers, only guns and money. I originally was going to include some financial advice in it until my then employer said, don't you dare. That would be considered advertising. And I actually had to go back and remove a handful of early posts, especially one where I did get a call, said, you've got to take this post down, where I'd accused BlackRock of virtue signaling. So we do a lot of business with them. You have to take it down. Okay.
Yeah.
Whatever. I want to keep my job. I'm free to do it now. I mean, I'm retired. So I do it mainly because I enjoy it. I still enjoy writing.
Excellent. And I know you're active on X and
X
Facebook.
And Facebook
are those
pretty much it?
Okay. Well, I'll be sure to link to those as well, your profiles on both of those pages.
And I picked up
and I know you comment sometimes at NRA and Danger as well.
I comment there occasionally. And members taking on Facebook, members taking back the NRA, friends of Save the Second, and then of course I do have a blog page where I'll post everything. So
awesome. Well, John, I really appreciate you tagging along for the podcast this evening. I think our listeners will hopefully learn a lot from this episode. And if they already knew a lot of this stuff, hopefully they at least learned a little. So thanks again for tagging along.
I appreciate it. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. All right, everybody, don't hesitate. I encourage you, please go check out the Only Guns and Money blog by John. It's an excellent blog. I follow it at least weekly, in times like this, daily, really, when there's lots of news coming out. So definitely go check that out and check him out at X as well. I'll link to all those in the show notes, so check those out. As always, you can find the podcast on YouTube, Facebook, Rumble, and at X at Forge of Freedom. And you can find us at forgeoffreedom.com. Until next time, everybody, remember, you are the Forge of Freedom.